Well, thanks everybody. Welcome to today's Thriving Through the Decade of Disruption webinar. I'm really excited today to have Mike Molinari with me. Mike will tell you a lot about himself, or a little bit about himself, and a lot about his experiences, but has an awesome job as managing director of the IP Group, which is this really interesting company that has been around for quite a while and has operations in multiple places around the world. But set up in Australia a number of years ago to help commercialise research out of Australia's leading universities. And in some senses, what I'm really interested in, why I'm so interested in talking to Mike today, is answering this question of what role does innovation play in our economy, and how do we sort of shoehorn innovation? We've got all these universities. I talk about this all the time. We're spending $10 billion a year on research in this country. And we get this really tiny amount of commercialisation out of that innovation. And clearly the government's saying over and over again, you guys have got to do better. You guys have got to do better. We've got to do better at translating our research because our economy desperately needs it, not just because we should, it's because we have to. You know, as a country and as an economy, we can't just spend the rest of our lives, you know, with rocks and crops and digging stuff out and sending it overseas. We've got to do a better job of creating knowledge-intensive jobs because that's what gives us the quality of life that we love. And what I'm really passionate about is we've got all these researchers, you know, at UQ, we've got 3,000 researchers, 12,000 PhD students, all really the brightest people in our society are sitting in this little place. And then we've got 100,000 of them around Australia and, you know, several 100,000 PhD students, but we just are struggling to get their ideas into a format that actually creates value or unlocks value economically. And so Mike's job, the IP Group, is entirely designed to do that. And I think what you'll hear, and I'm sure what you'll hear is how hard that is. But I'm really hoping that as we unpack that, we'll get some ideas really around how can you take an idea, how can you find an idea, a discovery of some sort of piece of intellectual property, and work out, is that of any use? What problem does that solve? And then validate or invalidate that. So Mike, maybe tell us a little bit about the IP Group and what your business is, and how do you go about that process when you've got access to all of these enormous billions of dollars worth of ideas? How do you go about identifying ones that you think could actually really have potential to be a game changer?
Thanks, Cameron. You've stolen my thunder there with a lot of that, and we're certainly aligned around both the need and I think a lot of the challenge that we have here in Australia. So IP Group, we're really all about building future industries, and really at the heart of our model, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second, is the idea that the next generation of disruptive technology companies will be born at the university bench. And that's really underpinned a lot of our approach and operations over the last 20 years. So IP Group started in 2000 with Oxford University, and we signed an agreement with the chemistry department there. And then we've expanded from that to now work with about 15 universities across the UK, at Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College, you know, most of the large research universities there. You mentioned operations in the US, so we started up there in about 2011, 2012, and we worked with some of the leading research universities there, Penn, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Hopkins, and a few of the federal research labs. And then in 2017, we signed partnership agreements with each of the group of 8 and with the University of Auckland here in Australia and New Zealand. And every university is slightly different, and the nature of how we work with each of our partners is slightly different. But fundamentally, we work closely together with the university and the researchers within the university. You know, we're engaging at the earliest stage. Our US colleagues have a great phrase of saying it's kind of Eureka +1. And you know, we engage at that really early stage with researchers at the point, you know, a long time before it's a company, at the point where there's an innovation, an invention, a discovery, and then we'll work with them in the university to shape that up into an investable proposition. And then we have, you know, fundamentally our business model is as an investor, and so we have capital to support that the creation of that company at the earliest stages, and then to support it all the way through. From, you know, we say cradle to maturity. Too often it's cradle to grave, but the hope is that, and the expectation, and really our job is to make as many of them cradle to maturity.
So Mike, tell me a little bit about that process of trying to find those ones when you see, and universities have this process of disclosing. So academics, they invent something, they discover something, they disclose it. And I know UQ has, 200, 300 disclosures of new ideas a year. And you guys have got GO8, so you've got 8 plus your Auckland, so 9 universities, hundreds and hundreds of ideas. How do you go through a process of being able to differentiate between those Eureka plus ones, which I love? How do you then be able to work out, well, which ones, what's the decision matrix that you go through to actually work out what do you think actually could work?
So, we have, like everything, you sort of start out with a defined process, and then where it gets really interesting is how you bend and break those rules to make them fit with reality and what we actually see. But fundamentally, what we look for at every stage of investment, but at that early stage, at 4 or 5 things. First one is really around differentiation, and I'll perhaps come back to that because it is so important, and talk about what we mean by differentiation. We want to be able to see that it's solving a big enough problem, and that it's going to be able to be, this is a rule we break quite a bit, but product, not a feature. We want to be able to see ultimately that there's a financial return, so that the return that we can see is commensurate with the risk that we'd be taking on, and how that's staged over time. And then I always put this at the end, which is slightly different from what a conventional venture investor would say is the team, because most of the time for us, we're helping to build that team around a new company, and around a new technology. So, it's more of a thesis around, can we build a team, and can we bring a team around this to help it grow, rather than a upfront gatekeeper around saying, do we think this team is backable? But come back to that point around differentiation, because it's really super important. We are a deep tech investor, and one of the things that we would look for in pretty much everything we invest in is novel intellectual property, and it's really fundamental to have a strong enough starting point that even with all of the that is differentiated enough from everything else that's out there, that even with all of the risk that comes with building a new enterprise from the ground up, if we get there, it's still going to be, over the time and the amount of money that needs to be invested, it is going to be different enough from everything else that's in the market, and we've got the support of that kind of intellectual property in the starting point to get there. So, what does that mean in practice? In practice, when for example, we see a new additive manufacturing technology, pitched to us from a researcher or from one of our university partners, we will then go through a process of talking to our colleagues internally within the Australian team, talking to our US colleagues, talking to our colleagues in the UK, and going out to all of our portfolio companies who are operating in that space, and really getting an understanding of how what we're seeing here relates to what they are seeing elsewhere. And, it's a pretty high bar for something coming out of UQ needing to be better than everything we're seeing out of Oxford, everything we're seeing out of Princeton, everything we're seeing out of Cambridge. But that's a really kind of fundamental thing. It needs to be differentiated, sufficiently differentiated from day one to be able to be comfortable that in 5-6 years, when we're at scale, we're going to have a position in the market.
Yeah, that's good. So I want to pick up a couple of things you talked about in your decision matrix, which is the differentiation, or let's just call it the idea, versus the team, versus let's just call the team, call it the execution. In some ways, I talk a lot about what's more important, the jockey or the horse, and in some senses, at a university level and an IP level, it's really about the idea. It's about the horse is where you're starting with. But what we know is there's a lot of really good ideas, and in some ways, I get a little not frustrated, but but I see there's a lot of really good ideas that maybe don't have, the idea is not, there's no deep tech IP there. But a lot of things in the industry are actually just really well executed. It's actually more of a business model innovation than a product innovation. So in some ways, I think, and being at UQ, I've been there for 15 years looking at different IP, you see some amazing game-changing pieces of IP that just don't go anywhere, because you just can't get the business model right. So can you talk to us a little bit about that process of seeing this thing, which looks like a game-changing idea? It's got the IP, it's got the differentiation potential. How do you then go about building the execution strategy to be able to, because in some senses, it's the business model innovation is, I think, as important, if not more important than the actual. So the differentiation gives you the ability to raise capital and to prove to people that this is, if we're successful, we can keep other people from coming in. But in reality, the likelihood is you're going to fail. And you're probably going to fail not because the idea didn't work, but because your execution failed. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and maybe some examples of where you've seen that?
It's really, really, I mean, you've nailed it, right? I mean, that's it. That's really, really tough. And I think and it's something that's particularly tough in deep tech. So in a lot of what I would call kind of light tech or tech-enabled businesses, and you might, apps, SaaS businesses, perhaps elements of fintech, kind of all of your risk really sits in execution and the team. Where you're trying to build a deep tech business, be that biotech, new energy technologies, hardware, you need to have both, the protection around the idea and that fundamental kernel and the execution work out. So it's almost an additional level of difficulty, and both need to really come good. Just as you were talking through your kind of question there, I was reminded probably of a good example from one of our portfolio companies in the UK, which illustrates it quite well. So it's a company called Ceres Power. They have what's called a solid oxide fuel cell. So it's a fuel cells have been the next big thing for 15 years. These guys have got what is emerging as really the world leading technology for a whole range of applications for fuel cells. So that company started in 2000. It was spun out of Imperial College and raised a bunch of money, listed on the AIM market in the UK, and they probably raised 65 million quid from investors. And they were pursuing a model of essentially owning the whole product. So they were, they had the unique fuel cell capability, but they were trying to build household boilers and household combined heat and power units, and trying to own them and sell them to consumers. And so that consumed a lot of capital, and they had a field trial that didn't work out, and investors lost faith in it, and the company essentially collapsed in about 2012. There was an element of technology there that the technology wasn't quite ready at that point. But a lot of it was around kind of the business model and the hubris of what they were trying to do. We first invested in about 2012, and we essentially rescued the company at recapitalisation at about £1 million valuation. So, it was essentially a new start from 2012. Changed the business model. The technology's always been that constant in the background. Changed the business model to one of focusing on the fuel cell component and then partnering with large corporates to get it into their products and have them incorporated into what they're doing. The company just went through £1 billion market cap last week. And it's a really good example, right? Like, it wouldn't exist without the underlying technology, and that technology being sufficiently world leading that, they're partnered with Bosch, with Weichai, the world's biggest bus manufacturer, with Cummins, with a whole bunch of kind of large global industrial players. But that switch in model was really what unlocked all that value from 2012 onwards. So I'm not sure that you'd necessarily say that the learnings from there are generally extendable, but it does highlight the importance of both of those components.
Yeah.
And so, for us, our initial investment thesis is generally around the technology. And then over time, and we'll design a development program that generally validates the technology in the first 12 months or so, and then there's almost that sort of second period of how do we build the right team and how do we build the right strategy around it to take it to market. Sometimes we get it right. We probably don't get it right as many times as I'd like, but we do have plenty of examples of where first time or second time through we've been able to get the technology and the execution piece working together.
Yeah, look, that's such an excellent example, and I think in some ways the stuff that I teach at the university, and what I guess I've learned through my experience of running the startup that I run, Progel, with the microencapsulation technology. We initially thought this was going to be an encapsulation technology that all of the food ingredients companies in the world would beat a path to our door because it just made so much sense. It was cheap and it added functionality. But ultimately, we discovered that they didn't care because they weren't selling their product based on how awesome it was. It was on price, or it was on some other position in the market, or on market access. And so I think that whole business model innovation is almost underrated because it doesn't really matter how good the idea is. If you got the wrong business model, you end up with a Segway. You end up with this thing which is just so amazingly inventive, but just doesn't solve the right problem, or doesn't. If Segway guys had actually done something maybe where, like with a Lime scooter model, if they'd waited 20 years, where you could hire it for in 60-second lots for $1, that might have worked. But who was going to pay $5,000 for a thing that you couldn't use anywhere?
Yep.
And so in some ways, I think, and the stuff we try and teach in the MBA program and in our master's programs using the Lean Launchpad methodology is really about, let's not talk about the idea. Let's talk about the problem and understand. You go through this process of problem solution fit, and then you go to product market fit. And actually that's really where you get, because sometimes you get hung up on the solution. And researchers, as you know, you get this all day. They get hung up. They've got this great solution, this great, brain cancer, breast cancer therapeutic, or this great, engineering widget, this great new robotic system. But in reality, unless you can find an unlock in the business model, you're probably going to end up with look at the Iridium satellite phone. Great idea, but $5 billion later, nothing, because really no one wants it. It doesn't actually solve a problem. So how do you go about, let's just take an example where you've got an idea, you've got an IP, you think there's a big market there, there's $1 billion market behind it. You've validated that the technology works, you've de-risked the technical elements to it. How do you go about building the team? How do you, do you employ a CEO? Do you engage one of your own staff to become CEO? Just tell us through the mechanics of how you take something that's been validated technically and actually turning that into a company.
A bit of a theme, perhaps, to say that it's really tricky, and there's no real secret sauce to it. And even if I look at our portfolio here in Australia, so we recently completed our 10th investment here, and we've taken a range of different approaches to different of those companies. There are a few where our initial investment has been really around technically validating a particular technical question, and our team have kind of stepped in to run the company through that initial stage and drive a sort of purely technical program for a period of time. And I think that's something that we've found over 20 years an important part of our model. Enables us to be lean, the company to be lean, focused on answering the real questions, because it's a slight sort of sidebar point to the conversation, but one of the challenges of those really early stages is you want to be lean and not deploy too much capital or raise too much capital into these companies. But it then becomes hard to attract the right sort of person to run it, because they're wanting appropriately remuneration package, and they're wanting the security of having a job that's going to continue for a period of time. So we'll often step in and manage it at the early stages. When we're doing that, we're always doing it with a view to stepping out at some point, and just continually engaging with people who might be good candidates to come in at an appropriate time and step in and run it. So that's just sort of a continual scan that's going on with these things. If I think through some of the other companies we've invested in here, a company Canopus Networks, which is a spin out of UNSW, it's a rare example where the lead researcher there, Professor Vijay Sivraman, was keen and also the right person to take it on as CEO, and so he's stepped out of his role with the university for at least a period of time to take that on and run it. And we've, through our network, brought in a very experienced chairman and helped to bring in some kind of senior executive talent from the telco industry to sit around Vijay in that leadership team. So that's kind of one approach that we've taken. And there's a couple where I think we've, as part of kind of our original developing our original thesis around the opportunity, we've gone out and sort of said, look, this needs a commercial leader from day one, and we've gone out through our network and found someone to come in and act as CEO of the company from day one. So I'm not quite sure how that's answered your question, but it really, I think, our experience has been a different approach is required for every different opportunity, depending on what's needed and what the resources are that are around the company.
Yeah, no, that's great. And before I go on, any of you guys that are watching, if you've got a question, please drop it down in the Q&A section, and I'll get to that in a minute. So drop in a Q&A question, and I'll have a chance. Mike and I can have a look at that. But Mike, interested in this idea of the market. Now, if you look at, say, renewable fuels, look at electric vehicles, any market. And I teach this stuff, and I get students working with researchers to try and do this, and everyone comes back with $1 billion market. Every market is worth billions of dollars. I mean, there's no market in the world that isn't worth billions of dollars. And so everyone says this is $1 billion market. And in reality, so every market's worth $1 billion or billions of dollars. How do you find those ones where there's that connection between the technology and the unlock of that technology and the right market that you think, like certain markets, say in the mining industry. The mining industry is trillions of dollars in the market, but really conservative industry, very hard to get innovations into that industry, very long lead times. Their asset lives are 30 or 40 years. Hydrogen storage, has been the bane of research, because I mean, UQ's had a number of startups in hydrogen, and great idea. Hydrogen's been promising so much for so long, but has never delivered because the capital costs of the innovations, it's the storage, you've got to have 20 or 30 or 40 million dollars. Startups got to raise just as pre-seed. So, yep. So how do you find those markets which are the right markets that the right unlock, the right technical unlock? How do you make that decision around which markets are the best ones to focus on?
It's again, theme for this conversation. It's really tricky. Our CEO in the UK, Alan Aubrey, has a phrase that he likes to use to describe the challenges that pretty much all of our companies go through, talking about emergent strategy. And, you can frame it up in a few different ways. I would probably think about it in terms of kind of hypothesis-led strategy. And what it boils down to in practice, is I think being, for us at every point, in our companies, every follow-on investment and really continuously through our engagement with them, being really rigorous around what are our key hypotheses around, whether this is going to be able to be a big enough opportunity and tap into a big enough market. There's always going to be uncertainty around that. And it's really just a matter of saying, okay, well, what are the key elements of that uncertainty? How comfortable can we get around them? And, being really transparent around, the where we are taking real risks. And then the emergent strategy piece comes around, continually reassessing those hypotheses in light of what we're seeing in the market or, what a company is experiencing, and, adjusting, the strategy in light of that. So an example, might be our largest portfolio company, which was an Oxford spin-out, Oxford Nanopore. And so that's a molecular sensing started out as a molecular sensing platform. So they use a nanopore protein, and at the point where we first invested, the idea was you could do really sensitive molecular sensing by, characterizing a molecule flowing through that nanopore, or having, specific pores that only certain molecules will go through. And the original hypothesis, product of its time in about 2005, 2006, was using it for testing for anthrax on the tube in London. Quick, easy, highly predictive readout, other molecular analytes. And then, that was one of the key hypotheses, that there'd be demand for that there'd be funding available, that, there'd be appetite to deploy that. And, about, I think, 12 or 18 months in, that wasn't playing out. And they went back and reassessed some of the core hypotheses and came to say, well, what about if we could use this for DNA sequencing? And ran with that. And so that is now, last round of funding was about £1.5 billion valuation. They've raised about over £400 million now over the 15 years, and one of the leading global platforms for DNA sequencing. But it's that kind of having the flexibility and fluidity and the rigor around saying, here are our key hypotheses, and then the ability to adapt and emerge over time.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think in many ways, university research, because it's curiosity driven, they're not, and I spend a lot of time being very critical of academics who just don't care about problems, they're just interested in solutions. I think, well, that's the arse end way of doing, innovation. Surely you should start with a problem and then build a solution. But I gradually, as I matured, I got to understand, well, that's what companies do. They have problems and they create solutions, and that's what results in incremental innovation. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you're working with academics who are unbounded by that, of course, it's a very, very inefficient, unproductive process. But occasionally you do get a way of doing something which is just revolutionary. And I think that the process of then trying to find an application is really hard, because mostly university academics, not mostly, but a lot of academics come up with stuff that is a platform, and that platform can solve an infinite number of problems. And so I guess in some ways the challenge is then trying to actually work out which of those applications is the best one to focus on. And I guess what we've learned, and what I've learned over the last 5 or 10 years is trying to have as many shots on goal as you can in the early stages. So you start with this divergent process where you're thinking of, okay, can do 5 or 10 different things. Can we have a small bet on a number of those different things and work out where is the technical challenge, and then where is the market challenge, and then try and work out which is A, got the most potential, and B, got the least challenge, and then follow that. And I think that's what we've learned through this process, and it sounds like what you guys have learned through this process of differentiating between technical challenge and market challenge, and then trying to synthesize the best fit between those two.
Yeah, so there's a few things I'd kind of pick up out of that. One of the members of my steering group for IP Group Australia has a great phrase, thinking's free. And so in doing that, mapping between, product and market, the more of that you can do without getting into the lab, the better, be that internal problem solving or be that external engagement with the market, that can help to really efficient. The other thing I was going to sort of pick up on is that what is often seen as a dichotomy between what industry does and how academics work. And one of the things that we see in really well-functioning ecosystems and highly productive university industry ecosystems is porosity and a two-way communication between those two spheres. Which is not to say at all that researchers shouldn't be focused on blue sky ideas, and that should be happening, but there is a blending and, if you will, a spectrum of activities, between the two, between industry and kind of pure blue sky academia, and that sharing of ideas two-way, has two-way influence, and is really essential, I think, to go right back to your first point. How do we get a better return in Australia, how do we drive, future productivity, jobs and growth from our $10 billion a year spend in research. One of the really key things is to get that porosity right, and that'll bear fruit on both sides.
Yeah. Look, you're right, and I guess it's that hybrid model of getting that right, having that enough ARC discovery projects and ARC linkage projects. So you've got partnerships, and so to follow that pathway a little bit, getting corporates or strategic partners engaged. Where does that fit? Because you guys are investing really early. I mean, what we know is that universities, we have this thing called, for other people, this technology readiness level from 1 to 9. How advanced is that technology developed by NASA to work out how advanced rockets were? And typically, universities create TRL 1 to 3. So early discovery, maybe some early data, some proof of concept very, very early, but no idea whether it scales, no idea what problem it solves. And what we know is that industry and companies want TRL sort of 8 or 9. They want something that's ready to launch, something that within 6 to 12 to 24 months, they can actually put on the shelf. And so we've got this TRL gap in the middle where companies don't jump down. They're not interested in university stuff because it's too early. Universities can't sell to industry because they say, look, go away, and when you've actually got something that I can show my customer, then. So at what point do you guys engage corporates in terms of validating that, look, if we build it, will they come? How do you, because obviously you're going to be too early when you make your first investment. But at some point you want to know that if you do de-risk that technology, that they will actually engage, because you don't want to necessarily be the company that's making the Tesla vehicle. You want to have a widget. So how do you work out when to engage with corporates?
Oh, day one. So kind of going back to that hypothesis-driven approach, always one of the key hypotheses is around, which customers or acquirers ultimately of this company are going to find it attractive and interesting. And yes, the state of readiness, at the outset is too early, but we want to have a hypothesis and test it around, if we can deliver X, Y, or Z, is that going to be of interest? And so, we've built up over the years, a pretty good network of corporate partners who we've engaged with, either as co-investors or strategic investors in some of our companies, as customers, or as just good relationships that we'll go out to and validate, whether this is differentiated, and if we can do, achieve something, is it going to be of interest? A good example perhaps was a technology we looked at recently from a couple of our Australian university partners broadly in the autonomous vehicle space. And we would have probably gone out and spoken to somewhere between 10 and 15 companies operating, all the way from drones to autonomous cars to, developing sensors, to developing autonomous vehicle software, to really get an understanding of where the gaps were, and if this technology could deliver what it was promising to, would it be special, and would it be of interest? I think that's really important. And I think, as you're talking about kind of models for universities to engage externally, there's Imperial College is a really good example. So Mark Dodgson, who's in the UQ Business School, I know writes a column for the World Economic Forum with David Gann, who's one of the leaders at Imperial. And Imperial have taken a really interesting approach to, engage structurally with industry and support those partnerships and cultivate those partnerships over a period of time. And I think you've seen that bear fruit. And they've done some analysis that says it bears fruit, both in terms of conventional academic metrics of publications and quality of publications, and in research funding, and in spin-out companies.
Yeah, that's good. And you're right. I've had a bit to do. I met with David Gann over in the UK recently, and he was talking about the White City campus, where they've got this multi-billion-dollar co-location, of Boeing and Rolls-Royce and GSK and some of these big companies. But talk to me a little bit about in Australia, because in some ways I get a bit annoyed, because they have GSK as their head office in the UK. So of course they're going to relocate to White City, right next to Imperial College. It's in London, for goodness sake, as is. But in Australia, we're just so far away from everywhere. Now you've got a network, I guess, through the IP group, but But how do you actually go about getting industry actually engaged? I mean, you can talk to them on the phone, have a Zoom call now, but it's actually really hard, I think, being in the the arse end of the world to actually get people engaged with it. So how do you guys go about building those networks?
Yeah, we have the good fortune of being part of IP Group globally, and we have that network that we can tap into, in the UK and in the US, both of which are big markets where you've got big industrial players. Australia does, to some extent, suffer from the geographical challenge and the time zone challenge of how do we engage with companies that are on the east coast of the US or Europe. There's probably two things I'd say. One is it's a hard slog, but you kind of need to do it, and just keep plugging away to build those relationships. And I know that that's what a lot of people and a lot of the universities here are doing and are working hard on. The other is domestic companies, and there's been a lot written over many years around the R&D intensity and willingness to invest in innovation and R&D of companies in Australia, and I think there probably is something to that, and it's easy and often what seems to happen in the debate is the university and the researchers get blamed. You're not talking to, you're not collaborating, you're not looking outside to industry. It's a two-way street. And I think perhaps I'm overly optimistic, but in a lot of our conversations with large Australian companies, even over the last 12 months, I would say I've seen an increased awareness and an increased, willingness to innovate, and an awareness that they do need to look externally, for that. As I say, that may be overly optimistic, but I'm certainly picking up some of that, direction of travel from them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've got a great question here from Peter Moy, and he's saying that places like Silicon Valley have lots of VC firms which are very narrow, very focused around their particular cookie cutter approach, as Peter says it. Where it's about fintech or it's about software or SaaS, and that they've got this very, very machinery orientated process because they know everything, they know the sector, they know the space, they know the customers. They know if they add enough money to this thing that they know they can execute it because they know who's going to sell it. Whereas in Australia, I guess we don't have such big consolidated industries. And so most VC firms and yourselves are probably not terribly different, is we try and play in a lot of different sectors. And so you don't have the actual pathway, this narrow pathway. Do you think, is that a challenge? And how do you guys contemplate that? Because you've got life science and physical science, which means you've got everything.
Yep.
Is that something that we should be trying to focus on, or how do we deal with that?
Yeah, so from our point of view, we're one organisation globally, and so we've got a team of about 100 around the world. So at that level of scale, I think we feel as though we can actually have decent industry knowledge and coverage across a range of different technology areas. But we're unusual in that, both the model and the scale of operations. I think what Peter's describing in that question is pretty much a reflection of the depth and liquidity of the the environment in Silicon Valley and in Europe, rather than necessarily a reflection of what people in Australia are trying to do, if that makes sense. So there's enough deal flow, there are enough companies, there's enough capital, and there's arguably too much capital in Silicon Valley at the moment. And what that enables is people to focus on either a specific stage of investment or a specific industry vertical. I think if you tried to do that in Australia today, you would not have enough, absent perhaps, fintech, or some sort of niches within SaaS, you wouldn't have enough deal flow to be able to sustain it. So I would expect, as the the scale and the depth of the market here in Australia develops, that we'd go down a similar route and you'd start to see a similar sort of thing. But we're a long way short of that at the moment.
Yeah. So would you say, and I think what you're saying, and I think this is true, is that we actually got we got almost a surplus of investment opportunities, of money, and not enough deals, not enough investable deals to actually go into. Is that a fair comment in Australia?
No, you're paraphrasing me slightly. I'm not quite sure that I'd say that. I think the situation's slightly different across different stages of investment. And others have kind of commented on this. I think where what you've said is probably closest to being true is at the really early stages, and that kind of seed, pre-seed kind of stage. We have a lot of early stage ideas. There's a lot of things that look quite promising at that stage, but there's not much capital and not enough capital. Sorry, that's the opposite of what you said, wasn't it? But that's true at the early stages. If you look right at the other end of the funnel, where you're looking at kind of mature technology companies, that's almost a reflection of what's happening earlier on. I'd say we're probably getting towards right size there. The environment's very different to what it was a couple of years ago, where there was very little capital around. Now there's more, but I still think there's the opportunity to grow that pool of capital that's available.
Yeah. And I think in some ways that challenge of actually getting the tech and actually then getting that investable proposition is a real challenge of actually saying, okay, great idea, great invention. Yes, you've got a patent. Yes, it's in a sector that's worth trillions of dollars, but is there a business here? And I think and a lot of universities don't actually have the capability to present that to even you guys as investors, in a way. So then you got to go and do the work, and you don't have the resources to work that up for 20 or 30 or 40 investment opportunities a year. So in some senses, it's almost resource constrained, not by the actual inventions, but by the ability to connect that invention into a business model, an investable proposition, for instance.
Yeah. One thing, people always say there's a lack of risk capital in Australia, and there isn't, right? I mean, or risk tolerance in Australia. So if you look at the amount of money that's raised by the mining exploration industry every year, if you look at even the amount of money that's wagered on the Melbourne Cup, it is orders of magnitude greater, and you're almost guaranteed a loss, particularly in the Melbourne Cup. But the amount of money that's prepared to take a punt on that is order of magnitude greater than the amount of money that is there and prepared to take a risk on early stage technology. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but it kind of, for me, illustrates that there's not a fundamental lack of risk appetite in Australia or by Australians. It's a misallocation problem.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what, in a clumsy way, what I was sort of heading to is that there's plenty of money, but it's the actual the money that is prepared to invest, but there's just not the opportunities haven't been packaged together in a way that is ready for that money to actually find and actually put it in a vehicle that at least offers a hope of a first place gain. But so just I'm just going to put up a couple of advertisements from our sponsor, just to let people know who are watching. Just close that down. Okay, we've got a couple of different courses, or a couple of different. So the next two Thriving in the Decade of Disruption workshops. One's with Terry Woodcroft, who's a founder in a company called Orcha, a great sort of engineering technology. And so we're going to talk to Terry about the journey. They've just recently done a first capital raise. So that's going to be an interesting conversation. And Paul Cernier, who's a founder of Tritium, which is potentially going to be another one of our next big billion-dollar companies who are doing fast charging for vehicles, for electric vehicles. And so they've had an amazing story. I used to work with Paul and Terry at UniQuest. So there'll be some interesting conversations around taking an engineering technology and turning it into a company and at different stages of development. The other thing I want to draw to the attention of people watching is that we have a number of short courses. The Leadership and Innovation course, which is only $8, you can do that online. as well as a number of other short courses, as well as our Masters of Leadership and Service Innovation, which is a fully online master's program. So we've seen an amazing increase in people interested in our courses. So you can see business.uq.edu.au. That's my 5 seconds of promo for the business school. And so, but what's interesting is that we do see that people are interested in, and I think ultimately that's why we've done this series, is that everything's changing, and it's changing. The rate of change has just got faster because we've all had time to think. And you talked about, thinking is free. And in some ways, I think that the future is actually going to be it's going to change faster than it did change in the last decade. The last decade, change happened gradually. We had .com in 20 years ago, and then everyone sort of took a bit of a while to recover from that. And then we had the GFC, took a little while to recover, but not as long. And now we've had this disaster, and it seems like the share market's just ready to bolt as soon as you give it an opportunity. So I think that rate of change is going to accelerate, and I think companies like yours are going to be in a great position to be able to exploit that.
There's a great quote from Kevin Sneeder, who's the Global Managing Director of McKinsey, that I think he was talking to a room full of CFOs, saying the pace of change today is the slowest that it will be in your lifetime. Wow. Which is a really interesting way of thinking about it. And I think it's probably true. We are only going to see the pace of change accelerate through our lifetimes. And that's a very different paradigm to the paradigm in which most of today's big companies have developed and most of today's, MBA and training courses have developed.
Yeah. Look, that's a great way to finish, Mike. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think in some senses, fortune favors the bold, and I think what you guys are doing, is just part of that ecosystem, along with Brandon Capital, who used to work with and got a lot of money, and Blackbird Ventures, and I had Phil Maul from Main Sequence Ventures. There's $1 billion worth of money going into early stage ideas. We just got to find a way to do it faster and better. And I think it's been so liberating to talk about some of the approaches that you guys have got, and it's great for us in Australia. You're an Aussie, but it's great for us to have this access to international networks to be able to make that just that much easier. So much appreciate your time, Mike. It's been great sharing some of my ideas, and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening in and have got a lot out of it. So I really appreciate your time.
Not at all. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks Cameron.
Mike. For those of you that are watching, we've got an online poll. If you can do that, Leah's going to put that up in a sec. But thanks again, Mike, for your time, and I hope to catch up with you again soon.
When they let us out of Melbourne. Thanks, Cameron.
Right. Thanks, Mike. Cheers. Bye-bye.